I think this is on now. Günaydın. Merhaba. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm very happy to be in this room because the next talk is going to be amazing. It's from a woman speaking about MailChimp. But today we're going to be talking about something different. I want to talk about, in 1999, the fact that NASA lost $125 million due to an engineering disaster. The Mars orbiter fiasco could be considered one of the worst information architecture disasters in history. Today, I don't want to talk about a disaster. I want to talk about World IA Day. By way of introduction, my name is David Peter Simon. I know it's strange, I have 3 first names. And as Hande mentioned, I was the global executive producer of a one-day celebration of information architecture that happens all over the globe. To simplify the celebration, it's kind of like meetups that happen everywhere, all at the same time. It even happened here in Istanbul, and I think User Spots was the one running it. Today I want to tell you a story about the information architecture of World Information Architecture Day. I specifically want to talk about how we organize information internally and how that applies to producing work and to other everyday work. I also want to share some of the service design work that I've been doing in East Africa and how that relates to all of this, all of our work. And I want to return to a notion called info-architectural ways of seeing. So we might continue to discuss how information architecture applies to everyday life outside of the digital. And in this talk, I'll share one tool, one technique, and one takeaway that hopefully you can use in your everyday work. So, before we begin, it is important to take a few steps back and understand this idea called info-architectural ways of seeing. In case you don't remember, the Mars orbiter fiasco was an engineering disaster that was caused by a mismatch in unit measurement. The 2 software development teams, Lockheed and NASA, mismatched their units of measurements. Basically, they weren't talking to each other. I'm sure many of you have seen that in the enterprise. They weren't talking to each other about their taxonomies, their ontologies. Lean experts might point to this as an example of process waste. And while there's many ways to dissect the damage, one thing is obvious. Clarity matters. By clarity, I mean the quality of being certain, definite, unified as a whole. Pointing to loose labels should be of no surprise at this type of conference. Information architects and user experience designers have been saying things like clarity matters for years. It's in a ton of books. One of the things that I think is magical about World Information Architecture Day as a celebration, like UX Alive, is it's starting to build a conversation around a subject that assists many industries and many different approaches. In fact, in 2009, Dan Klein, this gentleman here, in issue number 3 of the Journal of Information Architecture stated, and I quote, "The continuing work of young scholars and researchers in our field builds and expands the vocabulary for describing a way of seeing." I want to return to this idea, way of seeing, because as Dan put forth, IA, information architecture, must continue to differentiate the value of its particular way of seeing the same picture. Ansel Adams was also someone who really cared about ways of seeing. He's an old school photographer. And ways of seeing, of course, is important to photography. Many of you have phones, and some of you have cameras and like to take pictures. And when taking a photo, we don't only look out at what's out there in our viewfinders or on our phones, but we also think and emphasize what we see with it. We use those filters on Instagram. And as a friend of mine in philosophy might say, Patrick Allo, pre-imaging is active and conscious seeing, not just passive translation. So in a similar vein, I'm trying to think about ways of seeing in my own work, in my service design work, in my producing work. And I didn't see a definition in Dan's paper, and I couldn't really find an articulation of this concept in previous books. And I don't want to suggest a definition, but rather, as what my colleague Patrick Allo said, a reformulation of the question at hand. And you see here, for starters, I've just replaced the word design thinking with information architecture. It's a sort of provocation for us to think about, admittedly crude, but how do we ask questions with new tools? So for example, my question became, how does info-architectural ways of seeing apply to World IA Day, to producing a physical event, or celebration, rather? And why does ways of seeing matter? This is all very important because we live in an information society. This becomes more and more important every day because today all members of the G7 group qualify as information societies because, as Luciano Floridi, a professor at Oxford, would say, in each country at least 70% of GDP depends on intangible goods, informational goods. We're organizing information in our everyday lives. I recently quit my job as a senior experience design consultant to return for a master's at the University of Oxford because there's a really interesting discipline there nowadays called the philosophy of information that relates to how we can understand fundamentally ourselves as beings informationally. And this makes IA a sort of strong, nascent subject to have a unique conversation with philosophy. In short, we can think about everything informationally, our products, our services, and even ourselves. The idea that we can think about everything informationally is of central importance to our celebration. I'd like to take a step forward now and tell you a little about, our celebration, sharing some of the tools, techniques, and a takeaway story. And I'll place World IA Day in that wider context I've just shared on the previous slides, and I'll try to make it a little more tangible. So one of the important things to realize with World IA Day is that before the celebration, we created a series of guidelines. These guidelines are not dissimilar to design principles. They help us make decisions in the producing of our celebration process. And what we learn here is that guidelines, like design principles, can be applied to any business challenge. So then it's interesting when people ask, how does information architecture apply to like business operations, like producing a celebration? But aside from the fact that we've been very specific about each of the labels we've chosen to define our product, and when we peel away each of the structures, we see that information architectures, like taxonomies, play a role in that. Here, for example, we're looking at how we organize information in areas like Google Drive, a taxonomy, to enable it for future producers, say if I move on, as I have, to sift through organizational memory. This matters because World IA Day is a dispersed, not-for-profit team all over the world in 6 continents. And even in its most basic, organizing information in a sensible manner for business sustainability is important. How do you organize your information internally? How does your internal file structure look? Would you be proud to show it to the world? Would you be excited and thrilled? I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, as Raheem says, what works good is better than what looks good. This is not to say that brand identity is not important to World IA Day, for example. The work of our creative director this year, Francis, was integral to the development of our celebration. However, a brand identity plus an informational foundation, much better together. Even internal databases and clearly structured spreadsheets make for a powerful combination to scale your business. In fact, this year we scaled our celebration to over 5,000 attendees across the globe in 6 continents. Delivering people the sort of informational toolbox they need, cleanly and articulately, content like budgets and timelines, helps. I promised a technique, a tool, and a takeaway. But to be clear, by technique, I refer to a way of carrying out a task, particularly with a certain sense of style. For a technique, I'd like to suggest diagramming when we encounter business model design issues. I know this is not anything new, but it's surprising just how many times in different businesses and design that we fail to employ this type of technique and their related tools. We jump into wireframing, we jump into solutions. It is important to remember that a blueprint diagram is a model of something we want to create, and a celebration is something we also wanted to create. So for example, then, a diagram becomes a reification to make the abstract concrete of an informational cross-channel environment, facilitating a high-level conversation about a human gathering. These were some of the diagrams that came out of our conversation about how we would iterate our business model to make money this year. It's about turning the abstract concrete. How many conversations do you have a day that you walk away and you said, what were we just talking about? How might diagrams help solve that or stop that? By a tool, I mean a device for a particular function. Sometimes, when we advance in our careers, it is our role to take a step back from the aspects that are not our job. You grow perhaps out of being a designer or doing out of certain design tasks, or maybe even you just become a senior designer, so you're doing less of certain things. I don't know. But I guess while I'm a researcher-designer by trade, and I'm familiar with tools like wireframing, I felt I needed to recognize where my boundaries were in this process for World IA Day. We were working with a not-for-profit cooperative who had in-house designers who I respected the autonomy of. But that doesn't mean that I can't play a role in the structural design of information. And this matters because it means that I can get involved without being prescriptive on things like layout or taxonomy. I can avoid unnecessary conversations. You see here on the left, this is from Mark Bolton Design. You heard this earlier. Claire mentioned, I think, and quoted Mark Bolton. He's a fantastic designer. And he has this system called page templates. It's kind of like a CMS, but like before a CMS. It's essentially how you structure your information. And what we see here is that while the brand might change its realization in year, perhaps it might change its typography, perhaps it could change its logos, but these sort of templates, these informational templates, if desired, could live and be updated year on year. This is not too dissimilar from a content management system, but you can even just do it in spreadsheets and then communicate that without spending that engineering cost if necessary. Johnny Saldana, a researcher, once said, "You can't see the frame when you're in the picture." It's important for us to get out of ourselves and to try to use tools like diagramming and templating to kind of focus the conversation in ways that we want. So, as I wrap up, I have 9 minutes left, so we'll take our slow time now. By takeaway, I mean that I want to share the one idea I want you to remember from this talk. It is important to remember that Dave Rupert once said, "Your website is a manifestation of your organization's problems. It shows the world how you work together." Websites are a drop in the hat. We can redesign them. I suggest rather informational problems need to be solved and thought of with information architecture specifically in mind. With this in mind, we can stop arguing about whether something looks good and think more critically about what the little things matter, like labels and definitions, ontologies and taxonomies. For example, originally we had been saying that there were 57 cities. But not every place that wanted to host World IA Day, for example in Egypt or in Kenya or in Uganda, places that our community to us matter, they perhaps felt a little weird being called a city. They didn't necessarily feel like they could get involved. It's kind of like, imagine if you're not a developer and someone starts calling you a developer. Would you feel a bit awkward? I don't know. But labels make things a bit uncomfortable. Labels matter. We need to start to articulate exactly what we're saying. So by positioning this as cities, we were doing our community a disservice, not bringing the entire community around. So we changed it to locations. It's a small thing, but that helped us grow by 57% this year. Building a community these days isn't about throwing up wireframes or making a pretty brand, although that's so important. It's about all working together to make sure that we can get together and think critically about what we want to do. To dwell, to care so much about a word on a label comes from having a specific info-architectural perspective of the world. Here you can see our brand design folder. We organize all our design material to pass it to local organizers, and this material will go on physical and digital channels. These words matter because they float all over through different informational environments. They go on paper, they go on banners, they go on websites, they go on microsites, they go on blogs, they go everywhere. Words go everywhere. And as I mentioned with microsites, and I'm sure some of you have maybe suffered from the proliferation of microsites, so when you work in the enterprise, for example. But our challenge for us then becomes to have a sense of continuity, like design continuity, like labeling consistency. And what we learn here, and drawing on info-architectural ways of seeing, like we start to see that perhaps, as we see here on this microsite, it's not as easy as it looks. Sometimes it's hard to keep up that sort of strong brand awareness and sort of create brand guidelines that we speak together, just like labels. And we learn that it's a work in progress. It's constantly evolving. So you never just do the information architecture, like we'll do the taxonomy, then we're done. We'll do the sitemaps, we're done. It's always, and the key takeaway is that you don't create an information architecture in a vacuum with some diagrams. You don't create sitemaps in isolation. You constantly update them, you constantly work on them, and here then information architecture becomes less about a practice that is creating outputs or a methodological set of rituals, like Agile perhaps, but rather an approach or a worldview that might align itself with any number of disciplines, practices, etc. Information architects and people working in information architecture, regardless of current job scope or title, are well positioned to help people achieve their goals. For example, the Metropolitan Museum in New York City recently was sued for $1.6 million. They were sued over a word. They were sued over the word recommended. They were sued because they didn't have clarity in their pursuit. People didn't realize that, for example, you don't actually have to pay to get into the Met. And clarity then matters. And when the director of the Met says, our goal is clarity, we realize that when we have information architecture and an info-architectural perspective on the world, we can start to help people everywhere. So, I see info-architectural ways of seeing and the tools of information architecture helping me even in my service design work. Most recently, I've been working in what are known as peri-urban areas, periphery urban, places like no running water, no electricity, no internet. I work on operational efficiency of healthcare workers in this environment. And interestingly, the idea that labels cause confusion and pain pops up here too. So understanding and seeing problems not necessarily as domain-specific, nor simply as a design issue, which many of us come from, but rather inherently as an info-architectural one as well, not necessarily dichotomous, but all together, well, that really helps. It helps me, at least. And when I reestablish my problems with this in mind, I help, and we can help, enable our stakeholders and our clients and our teammates to see problems anew, and to provide them with trusted tools to tackle troublesome problems. Things like diagrams aren't going away, ever. Approximately 40% of newborn deaths globally are due to illnesses like malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea, and sepsis, all conditions that healthcare workers, untrained healthcare workers at times, can address. It logically follows that many institutions seek to equip healthcare workers like this in low-income nations like Uganda and Kenya, mobile health technology. Mobile phones. There's a substantial body of scholarly literature that looks into how these tools, basically organized information that is structured and delivered in different channels and different technologies, helps them to do their job. I've been very lucky to be working as designer in residence with Medic Mobile, a not-for-profit technology company that builds mHealth applications for these healthcare workers. And when I talk to healthcare workers, I use their bespoke design practice, Medic Mobile's. It's essentially a series called Design Cards, which allows me to facilitate a conversation even when we don't speak the same language. We use these design cards, seen here, essentially little sketches, to sort of think about and talk about things like, what does this icon mean to you? And what sort of workarounds do you make on your system? These are fundamentally ontological and taxonomical problems, in addition to being design issues. As Diana Kane, senior designer, mentions, and I quote from this blog post here, achieving a shared understanding of the images, the sketches, is typically pretty easy when a card is laid down in reference to certain people, places, or actions. If someone uses a card differently than others, that's not necessarily wrong and might even be enlightening. Here we might reference ontology again. These sketch cards, simple, lo-fi diagrams, lo-fi information visualizations, is about actively and organically getting beyond the fuzziness of words. And it helps to have an info-architectural perspective because it focuses on what Abby Covert, who some of you may have seen previously, and who has a fantastic book out called How to Make Sense of Any Mess, referring to as the pain with no name, what we might point to as a pain of informational disorder. The organization of all of this information matters for these women particularly because it can help them do their job efficiently to eliminate waste and save time, especially when time is precious, as time is precious for all of us. Imagine trying to help a baby with convulsions when you are not a trained nurse and you've been handed a poorly organized set of information, whether it's paper or an app or an e-health system on a desktop. Clarity thus engenders efficiency, and we can extend this idea to business as well. In closing on the notion of info-architectural ways of seeing, I would like to quote something I heard from David Lynch, the filmmaker. He says, "We write things down sometimes, letters, words, hoping they will serve us and those with whom we wish to communicate. Letters and words, calling out for understanding. I suggest we focus on understanding. Start to see the inherent informational disorder around you. Dismantle it. Question it. I'm not sure if you see the world in the same way I do, but I find that perspective very helpful. And join our community. World IA Day happens all over the world, and I only learn these sort of things, and I'm still learning them, because of the support and mentorship of all the different organizers across the globe. As I mentioned, it's in 57 locations, and it's often free. Come up and find me. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to help you start one in your location, and we can then have a conversation together about that. Lastly, thank you so much to Mustafa and the team at UserSpots for organizing an amazing celebration, probably the coolest I've seen in the Middle East, well, Asia and Europe. Anyways, teşekkürler. May I take your photo quickly, by the way? Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Very quickly. 1, 2, 3.